but before, I guess we all have each other's names. We have gone around. Let's see, Charlie, you're our new kid on the block, but you have introduced yourself to, not the newest anymore, right? But Rob couldn't be here with us this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
It'll be Bruce Kimmel. Bruce Kimmel is he's our financial advisor, vice president with Ellers. They're out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. They've been our financial advisor now for 2 years. Before that, we had Springstead. We want to try to do our part in 25 minutes at most to give you as much time as you need to ask questions related to the public financing of this project. There's just 3 thoughts or points that I'm going to share in just the next 5 minutes. And the first, and I had a chance, thanks to Bill, to go back over the Planning Commission hearing video and sort of see some of the questions that people ask. And one of the things that I came away with is that this project, and in particular the gateway, as it relates to the redevelopment of that site, has been going on really since 2002 with the Hyatt Palma plan and some of the first things that were brought up in that plan and the designation of that area as the East Gateway. I asked Scott Peterson today to pull out all of the actions that the City Council and Planning Commission have taken since that time. They're all here. There's 42 separate actions that were taken by the City Council and Planning Commission. There was a comment related to they think the project's moving too fast. And my argument would be this is not moving fast, and there's a whole lot of work that if you're just new to the discussion, you haven't seen, because it started back in 2002. Not included in this list, by the way, is the fact that the county redesignated the floodplain admission as part of the county-wide effort. So they actually expanded the floodplain admission, and if you remember, that became official in January of 2004. It became official on the maps in the summer of 2009, and that map will be changed effective February 8, 2012. So the gateway will actually, on a map, not appear in the floodplain. It does appear in the floodplain now, but on February 8th it becomes official and it's no longer in the floodplain. That becomes important because if you want to participate in the FEMA floodplain insurance program, if you have anything that floods, you want to be able to do that, you can't allow people to construct property in the floodplain. So you have to remove the floodplain or remove the property, whichever one you choose to do. That floodplain improvement was not only beneficial to the Gateway project, but it also removed 80% of the property that in the work that we did at the Knoll Avenue Bridge from the floodplain. So we're left with about 20% that's still in the floodplain right now. So there's all that LOMR work related to work that we've done with FEMA that doesn't show up on that list. There's also a lot of work related to council policies. Before we even talk to the developer about what the incentives were that would be available, we have City Council Policy 106 that talks about how we will take a TIF application, how big the project has to be, the fee that you have to pay, the feasibility study you have to do, and the steps you have to follow. We have City Council Policy 112 that relates to private activity bonds, which allow developers to make improvement. It also has the same set of frameworks. And in 2009, the City Council adopted a CID policy, which came on the heels of the state legislature approving a CID statute in Kansas, similar to what you see in Missouri. So all of those council policies aren't up there. You do not see all of the various iterations of the Gateway feasibility study or analysis. Those aren't included in that list of actions. There's a whole lot of work that's been done to this point. We are not moving too fast. The fact that we're able to move it along is a function of all the work that was done over the last 7 years. So while it might appear to some people we're moving fast, to Bruce, I, and Laura Smith, it seems like we've been moving really, really slow. Second, in addition to all of these steps, as the City Council members will recall, in 2004, in the fall of 2004, we went out and did an RFQ, request for qualifications, for appraisal services to buy a property that was in the floodplain, a land use attorney, and an independent financial advisor. The one thing that we knew is if we take on this large stormwater project and we start removing properties and redevelopment occurs, we're going to need 3 people in addition to our staff that can help us. Lathrop and Gage, who was selected and reselected. We've since gone out again and did a request for qualifications for these services. Springstead was once our financial advisor, it's now Ellers. Our appraisal services is that, Shaner? No, not Shaner. Integra Realty is our appraisal services. So we've gone through the process of vetting and finding the people that can help us carry these large projects forward, in addition to the staff that we have. And third, and my last point and the most important, whatever Bruce puts up here, in the end, what we have to determine is the appropriate amount of profit that we are going to allow the developer to have, or the internal rate of return we are going to allow for the project. That's our job. We have lots of questions about star bonds, who backs them. I think Bruce has a really great handout that sort of shows how this works. I get lots of questions about city debt, TIF debt, IRBs, IDBs. Bruce will go through all of those. And at the end, if you have any questions, Bruce and I will be glad to tackle them. These aren't new. In fact, we've had sort of the same set of hearings or discussions 4 years ago. So it's really an update of the development agreement that we're currently working on. And many of the things and the frameworks that we're using, we used 2007, 2008. With that, Bruce.
So as I was saying, I wanted to give you a brief overview of some of the financial dynamics that we look at with economic development, and specifically put them in the context of the Gateway. Mike covered this a little bit, but I just wanted to start again with what our role is as your financial advisor. We're an independent public finance advisor, so we're not affiliated with a bank or an underwriting company or a development company. All we do is advise cities, counties, school districts, and other public entities around the Midwest. And so as such, our fiduciary duty is to you, the public entity, in this case the City of Mission. And our responsibility is to try to protect your fiscal interests at all points in the process with the Gateway, to use our experience and our expertise and our analytical abilities to make sure that we're covering all the bases and not putting you at undue risk. We'll, throughout this process, be working very closely with city staff as well as with the council, and we'll be working particularly with the chair and vice chair of the Finance and Admin Committee, probably on a weekly or near weekly basis. But please, as Mike indicated, please call me, email me, whatever, with any questions you have along the way. You'll probably be getting a lot of questions from constituents and others about the financial elements, and I want to make sure you are comfortable with our analysis and the answers we're coming up with. I do have some cards, and please take one, and again, feel free to contact me. We will also be communicating with the developer on a pretty frequent basis. Again, we work for you, but it's imperative that we understand all of the project details. We'll probably be going into what the developer will be considering pretty annoying levels of detail, but that's our job, and to understand their negotiating position so that we can respond effectively. So then I wanted to give an overview of some of the likely Gateway tools, and in putting together this list, we really looked at the 2008 agreement. As Mike has indicated before, we expect that the new agreement will be substantially similar in terms of the tools. Of course, the amounts and the specific mix or combination will be different, but you should expect to see these tools. So with TIF, at least in the way we expect to be using tax increment here, this is a tool that allows you to capture incremental new property taxes that are generated from new value generated through development. And I'll be talking a little bit more about TIF in a minute. Star bonds, you're aware of this tool. It's been talked about quite a lot. This captures new state and city sales taxes. So in that way, it's like TIF again. It's just capturing new taxes from the Gateway project to finance certain project costs. The CID is a new element. In the 2008 project, we had something called a Transportation Development District. This is a new piece of legislation that was passed since 2008, And it allows the development to impose on itself a supplemental sales tax on top of the existing sales tax. Now, if you think about it, they will need to get the consent of their tenants in order to do that. The CID can be used for other tools. It will certainly be part of our analysis. It's not like a freebie for them. It is tax revenue, so it will be part of the analysis. But that is something that they will need to decide to what extent they want to bring that into the financing plan.
Bruce, excuse me.
Yeah, Connie.
What % of the tenants need to support CID?
Really, it's pretty much a unanimous decision. It doesn't need to be put on all of the gateway, but for the ones that it applies to, they need to essentially consent to it as part of their lease agreement. Yeah. Next slide, great. IDBs, this isn't really a financing mechanism in that it's not a source of revenues, but it's a way of financing certain costs or funding costs, and it's also a cost avoidance measure. These are industrial development bonds, and this is a tax-exempt financing mechanism to fund construction costs. We expect that this will come into play with at least a portion of the gateway costs. And one of the big benefits of it here in Kansas is that it also allows for an exemption from sales tax for construction materials, which on a $200 million project is a pretty big number. You often hear about tax abatements in conjunction with IDBs. That will not be a component here, of course, because we're planning on using the property tax dollars, tax increment, those incremental dollars rather, for tax increment, and so abatement would not come into play. Other city revenues that are in the mix and may or may not have a part in the gateway, but will certainly be impacted by the development, are your lodging revenues and franchise fees, the stormwater drainage district that pertains directly to the gateway, and the sort of backstop benefit district that we set up in the 08 agreement. That was a provision that if all else failed, you could actually specially assess some of those costs to the development. And I think that was a good security measure to have. So we would look at retaining that as well. Okay. So any questions so far on that overview? I know I'm going at a fairly high level, but hopefully this is a good refresher or a good introduction for those of you that haven't dealt with this alphabet soup before. So TIF, as a working definition, it's a pretty simple concept actually. It's your ability to capture and use the, again, increased local tax revenues from new development within a defined geographic area for a defined period of time. And so really getting into the nuances of TIF and of STAR and of TD or of CIDs, we could really spend a whole session just on those, but I think by that point you'd be on the floor. It's pretty dry. Just know that it's got a set of rules that go with it. Every state has different rules, and we're very familiar with the Kansas rules, as is Pete Heaven, and we'll make sure that everything that happens with TIF goes according to the state statutes. In Kansas, you can capture both the incremental property taxes as well as the incremental sales taxes. So in that way, the STAR bond approach is really like a sales tax TIF, but we call it STAR instead of TIF in this circumstance. If you'll just click all the way through. Great. So this little graphic just tries to illustrate visually what happens with TIF. So when you have new development, you get new assessed valuation. In Kansas, you start with appraised value, and then that gets translated to assessed value. That TIF district captures your increased value from new development and the taxes that are generated from that, at least the majority of the taxes. If you'll click one more time, Mike. So the TIF is, again, that captured value times the TIF eligible mill rate, and that gives you your TIF revenues that you collect on an annual basis from that district. A couple of really important things. The TIF eligible mill rate doesn't include the state's very small property tax as well as part of the school district tax rate, but it includes the city, county, and part of the school district primarily. Also, with the existing value, or what we call the original assessed value, all of the taxes that are generated from that value still go to the city, the county, and the school district as they currently do. So in that way, again, you're really capturing the incremental value and the incremental taxes through TIF. So then, once you're collecting TIF revenue, well, what do you do with it, right? The whole point of TIF is to capture it so that you can help pay for certain costs, either public or private costs related to redevelopment. Well, the three major ways that you actually capitalize or use the TIF in Kansas are as follows. There's a pay-as-you-go note, and a pay-as-you-go is basically an IOU in which the developer pays for the TIF-eligible expenses that you've agreed to reimburse them for. And then you use the TIF on an annual basis to repay them with interest over time. So it really is just making payments on an IOU. The thing about pay-go that is often helpful is that there's no risk to the TIF authority, in that case that would be you, if the term were to expire before the ultimate note was paid off. So if TIF revenues come in less than projected, you don't pay off the note expires, and that's it. I believe you have a couple of pay-go notes in place now with Mission Crossing, is that right? And CapFed. So you've taken that mechanism before. The next, I guess, layer of involvement would be to actually issue a bond called a special obligation bond. And this is what we would call a pure revenue bond, where it's a municipal bond, it's the city of Mssion, Kansas that would issue the bonds, but the bonds are payable solely from the project revenues, the TIF revenues in this instance. In this case, the investor is really taking the risk of the TIF not coming in, right? And so as a result, they'll want a higher interest rate than they would on a GO bond, and we'll get to that in a minute. And they'll also want a lot of debt coverage to minimize the risk of not having enough revenues. But it's really critical to understand that with special obligation bonds, the city does not bear any risk to your tax base and to your general obligation, full faith and credit. This is a slide about TIF. I'm going to stay away from the tripod. But I thought it would be helpful to pass out the front copy of a Star Bond official statement that the city of Manhattan had back in 08, or excuse me, in 2009. The paragraph that you'll see in brackets is the kind of language that you would see on a special obligation bond. I'll try to keep them copy. Thanks. And I'll wait for you all to receive it, and I think I made some copies for the audience as well. But what's interesting about this cover is it says about 3 or 4 times, very explicitly in bold, that this is not an obligation of the city. And so I'd actually just like to read that bold section in brackets. And again, this is from Manhattan's Star Bond issue from 09. I think it's noteworthy to note that Gilmore and Bell was the bond counsel on this issue. They're the ones who wrote this wording, and Gilmore and Bell is the city's bond attorney as well. But if you see the bold section in that bracketed paragraph, the 2009 Star Bonds shall not constitute a debt or liability of the city, the state of Kansas, or any political subdivision thereof within the meaning of any state constitutional provision or statutory limitation, and shall not constitute a pledge of the full faith and credit of the city, the state, or any political subdivision thereof. The issuance of the 2009 Star Bonds shall not directly, indirectly, or contingently obligate the city, the state, or any political subdivision thereof to levy any form of taxation therefor, or to make any appropriation for their payment. And if you read the entire 350-page official statement for this bond issue, that same representation is made about 10 other times. So it's very, very clear legally and for the investors that this is just the pledged revenues, no full faith and credit. And I think it's helpful to realize that both for any potential new TIF bonds for Gateway, but also the Star Bond issue. So then there is the GO bond option with TIF, and there was a small GO bond TIF component with the previous Gateway agreement. But this would be TIF that is secured, or bonds, excuse me, that are secured both with TIF and the authority's full faith and credit. So there is some risk there, right? If the TIF is less than the debt requirement for a given year, you, the authority, would be required to cover the gap with other revenues. Now, there's ways we can mitigate this risk of this happening. We can have shortfall agreements with the developer. We can require the developer to post a letter of credit or some other kind of credit enhancement to prevent the possibility of you ever needing to actually appropriate funds. Debt service reserve funds play this role. So there's lots of ways we can put belts and suspenders on it. And one of our jobs would be, if there were any kind of GO bond with the gateway, would be to try to minimize the chances of anything happening with the city needing to appropriate. So this has a lot of text on it, and I know I've violated the rules for PowerPoint many times already, but I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the other details that we work through as your financial advisor. We've talked about general versus special obligation bonds. There's taxable versus tax-exempt debt. A lot of this has to do with whether the developer is providing a guarantee or not, who's receiving the benefit of the bonds. And so we would work very closely with bond counsel on that question. There's a question of temporary versus long-term debt. With the gateway, does it make sense to issue some temporary bonds just for construction and then refinance with long-term debt, or to issue the long-term debt right away? As you may know, we're at 50-year lows in the bond market. It may make sense to just issue the long-term debt right away. There's a lot of considerations and scenarios that we'll run in looking at the best approach there. There's debt coverage ratios and other covenants that the investors would look for with bonds. And then there's the method of sale, competitive sale, negotiated sale, private placement. So just know that there's a lot of things that we'll need to work through. We do expect that Gateway will have a combination of funding mechanisms. And of course, the developer will have their own private mortgage as well as their own private equity into the project. So then the goals of doing this kind of analysis and scenario running would be to find the mix that closes the gap for the developer with an appropriate return on investment, repays the city's investment in infrastructure, uses those revenue streams, TIF, STAR, and CID efficiently, and minimizes the city's risk. Okay, a little bit more on risk and cost. You know, we talk about risk, we talk about cost. Well, we'll be very clear on talking about, is this the city's risk, is this the developer's risk, so that you understand exactly how that dynamic is playing out. And I thought it might be helpful to give an example of how this plays with both special obligation and GO bonds. So with SO bonds, as we've discussed, that has very low city risk, as you saw with the STAR bond official statement. But as such, you have a higher interest rate, which means that for a given revenue stream, you can support fewer project revenues, right? Because if more goes for interest, that means there's less principal that can be supported, which means there's more private funding that will be required, both mortgage and equity, and a lower rate of return for the developer. With GO bonds, there's higher city risk, but a much lower interest rate, which means more project costs will get supported by that given revenue stream. That means the developer needs to come up with proportionally less private financing, and that means a higher rate of return for them. Again, we would focus on reducing risk if there were any GO, as with the 08. So you can see the balancing act. We're needing to close the gap to get to a deal that works, but we're also needing to mitigate the risk. So we'll be looking at a number of different ways of doing that. So a big part of our analysis will be to look at the developer's capacity to complete the project. We want to make sure that in the last some years since the 08 agreement was done, that they've still retained and hopefully enhanced their financial standing to complete the project. We'll look at the development budget, all public and private parts of the budget for the gateway. We'll look at the sources and uses of funds. This is really key, looking at exactly where the developer expects the money to be coming from, and then putting our own thoughts and analyses into that as alternatives. And then coming up with an operating pro forma. And what that is basically just a cash flow. So given the budget and the financing projections, we segue into a 10-year pro forma. How is this project going to work, and what kind of profits do we expect the developer to achieve? This will all be stirring and changing on a pretty regular basis until we come up with an agreed set of assumptions where we and the developer say, okay, this is what we think that the assumptions will be for the project. What we'll have as a result of this analysis are, again, that indication of the developer's feasibility and the project's feasibility, an estimated internal rate of return. We'll have some really good ideas on how to negotiate the use of the financing tools within the parameters. I said like parameters so much I said it twice. Set by city policies. Those are the policies that Mike laid out. And all aspects of this analysis will be summarized in one document. Back in 07-08, I prepared a very, it was a 10 or 12 page document that laid out all of the details in our analysis, and you should expect to see a similar analysis in this process. Okay, almost done. Last thing I wanted to talk about is, I've been talking a lot about development finance tonight. You know, what are the revenues, tools that can be used, what are the bonding mechanisms that can be used to finance costs related to the gateway? Well, it's also critical that we ask questions about the city's finances, and we'll be looking at that in detail as well. Some good questions that you should be asking and thinking about with the city's fiscal position through this is, how much have you invested to date to make the gateway work? Now, some of this you had to do anyways with flood control, but it's important to put a number on it so that we know what we're negotiating toward. How much more will the city need to invest in infrastructure? We don't think that's a lot, but there may be some improvements to Shawnee Mission Parkway, maybe some other small street improvements, and we need to quantify that. If more is required, where will that money come from? Will that be coming from the STAR bonds or from another source? And then that's all capital, right? What about operating costs? What operating costs will you incur when the gateway is open and we have all these people coming, both from the immediate area, but also other parts of the region and surrounding areas? And how will you pay for these expenses? We need to have an answer for you and for your constituents on this question. And then what happens if those operating revenues fall short? Now, I know from talking with Mike and Laura that they'll be doing their utmost to not rely on gateway-specific revenues to cover operating costs. But again, we need to make sure that you understand that there's a game plan in place there. Just like when the city refinanced some of its gateway investment back in 2009, we structured it so that you could pay back the bonds regardless of whether and when gateway happened. We need to have a similar kind of plan in place for the operating costs. So that's what I had for you. I hope it was informative, and I think Mike and I would be open for any questions.